Hey folks, Jamie here. Thank you for tuning in. Before we get started, I would like for you to take a moment and go down below and hit the like and subscribe buttons. Maybe leave a comment. If you're really feeling generous, maybe share this video to your social media feeds. What that does is make it a lot easier for other people to find a Moment of Tiki. I really appreciate it and it helps out a lot. Thanks. Now, on with the show. Welcome back to another episode of A Moment of Tiki as we dive into part 2 of music for a Dark Tiki Bar. Now, the previous episode I talked about exotica, haole, and related genres of music, and today we're going to start off with contemporary indigenous music. Now, hang on. I'm talking a lot, throat gets dry. Tiki is a made-up thing. It does not directly draw or represent any specific culture, but it is not made up of whole cloth. Tiki borrows from cultures all around the world, predominantly Polynesian, but also Latin American, South American, some African, different places like that. Therefore, from my perspective, it only makes reasonable sense from an ethical and moral standpoint that when we can, we support indigenous artists from these cultures from whence we borrow. Now, with contemporary indigenous music, these groups combine traditional instrumentation, themes, and music with modern technology and interpretation. They're cool and they straddle genres. Their sound may or may not work for you, but they're definitely worth checking out because there's some good stuff here. The first one I've got to talk to you about is probably the most famous worldwide. That's Te Waka. It's a Polynesian group made up, well, they're based in New Zealand, but their founder is from Samoa, I believe, and they have members who come from various different cultural enclaves within the entire scope of Polynesia. They are most famous for contributing to the Moana soundtrack, which is very good, and a lot of it's worthwhile to incorporate in your Tiki playlist as well. But that is not what made them. They had a long and storied and popular career long before Lin-Manuel came and knocked on the door and said, hey, I want you to contribute to this new Disney movie that's coming out. They have quite a few albums. They have some albums that are devoted strictly to drumming, Polynesian drumming. They really embrace their culture and express it in their music. And it has that, it feels authentic. It is authentic. They are approaching, much like the Hawaiian Renaissance I talked about in the last episode, this is kind of more of a widespread Polynesian Renaissance where these people are within the culture and expressing their needs and desires and priorities outward, as opposed to, say, the haole era where people from outside the culture were expressing what they assumed were some of the important elements of the culture, kind of a back to front approach to it. Another group, and sadly I don't believe they're together anymore producing new music, but they had some out there earlier that is definitely worth seeking out, is Matato'a, a Rapa Nui band that is known to some as Easter Island. They're high energy. They incorporate modern instrumentation with indigenous elements. They can rock. They really do. Just look them up online. They're infectious, high energy. If you like something a little edgier in your Tiki Bar playlist, then they may fit the bill. There's another one, New Generation, They are Tahitian. They kind of have a bit of a reggae sound to them, I believe. I hope I'm not misremembering right there. It's been a while since I listened to them, but they come from the French Polynesian tradition and are quite popular in that sphere. One more I want to mention is Oke Rios. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. They're from New Caledonia, and I don't believe that's actually Polynesian. I think that's Melanesian, part of the cultures that include Papua New Guinea. They have some really interesting sounds, and definitely worth seeking out. And again, these groups kind of do authentically what exotica was doing by sleight of hand. They actually incorporate their culture and present the exoticism, although it's obviously not exotic for them, but they are giving us glimpses into the modern incarnations of their culture. And I think it works well mixed in with the Tiki playlist. A lot of the stuff's upbeat, a lot of it's uplifting. Okay, now we are getting to the modern de facto Tiki Bar musical genre. That is surf music. Now, surf music itself is not modern. Surf music dates back to instrumental groups from the late 1950s who had their heyday in the early 1960s. They played a reverb-drenched electric guitar-driven sound. That's the surf music sound. But I'll bet you the first surf bands that come to mind, or your mind, if you're not that familiar with it, are not actually surf bands, at least not considered surf bands by the strongest devotees of the genre. First that comes to mind, Beach Boys. Beach Boys were the most successful of the Southern California surf beach rock sound early on, but apart from a few instrumentals on their very first album that they put up, not really surf band, they don't feature those hallmarks. Most of their stuff is based around the vocal harmonies. Musical genius Brian Wilson composed, influenced highly by the harmonies of the Four Freshmen, very vocal centric, which eliminates a lot of what the Beach Boys do or did from contention as actual surf music. Now, personally, I don't have an objection of including Beach Boys in a Tiki Bar playlist, especially the early Beach Boys, the first few years that they were putting out stuff, but they're not exactly a surf band. Neither is Jan and Dean, who started off kind of more as a doo-wop group, vocal group, were actually on a career downslide when the Beach Boys hit big. Got a couple of songs from Brian Wilson, recorded, reinvented themselves as one of the Southern California sun and surf groups, and the rest is history. And the third one is the Ventures. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, Ventures had guitar, they had reverb, they had instrumentals, not really known for their vocals. They should certainly be a surf band, right? Well, yes and no. The Ventures put out several surf albums, but the Ventures started off as an instrumental group, not strictly beholden to surf. And when surf popularity declined, the Ventures went on to record other instrumental albums that had no connection whatsoever to surf. Ventures recorded disco albums, not quite surf music ready. So, with those guys out of the way, and again, perfectly fine to incorporate some of that music into your Tiki Bar playlist, but just be aware, because I'm not a purist, but some purists might call you on it. So if those are not surf bands, then what is a surf band? Well, you can start off with Dick Dale, the self-proclaimed king of the surf guitar. Dick Dale is the quintessential reverb-drenched guitarist. Recorded lots of songs, had a string of hits, appeared in a bunch of the American International Beach Blanket Bingo movie. He was popular, stayed popular, was recording new stuff well into his elderly years, into the new millennium. So he's a good place to start. The Surfaris. Any band that records Wipeout definitely deserves a spot on this list. They're kind of hybrid, though. On their albums, they included some vocal songs, a lot of Beach Boys covers there. They weren't great vocalists. Their strong suit was indeed the instrumental reverb guitar, so that's why they get a place on this list. The Astronauts were a landlocked band from California. They only had one hit, Baja, in 1963, but they produced a string of popular albums, and they still have their followers today. Pretty good from a group that was 1,000 miles from the nearest beach. Now we get into the modern times. Lost Straitjackets are probably the most popular surf guitar band around today. They were formed in Nashville in 1988. Been going strong. They put out a dozen albums, probably more. They've got Christmas albums. A lot of high energy, pumping, popular tracks there. The Surfragettes, a girl band from Toronto. What's not to like? I first came across them, as many people did, pre-pandemic, when they had the insane viral hit cover of Britney Spears' Toxic that just went nuts online. Now, I'm not and never have been a fan of Britney Spears, but when I heard that guitar cover of that song, I said, holy crap, that's cool. I actually got to see them in concert this past year. Rockin' high energy. They're a lot of fun. If you can check them out in person, I highly recommend it. They've got one album, an EP, and a string of singles out from High Tide Records, so their music is readily accessible, and they also seem to be channeling their inner Spinal Tap, because they go through drummers at an alarming rate. Haven't heard of any spontaneously combusting yet, but Annie, if you're listening, we're pulling for you. Now, to get a little more local, I want to say check out the Del Vipers. That's a band in Austin. They've got 3 albums out now. Their most recent is the semi-self-titled Lost Del Vipers. They've got a lot of different influences on display here. In fact, one of the tracks off their latest album kind of reminds me of Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd, if you can believe that. So that's someone to keep an eye on. Going south down Interstate 35 to San Antonio, we come to the Phantomatics, which are a self-proclaimed spooky surf band. Their music is moody and atmospheric and has little tinges of horror elements to it. So that is a fun take on the genre. The Insect Surfers are a band that formed in Washington, D.C. way back in 1979. They bill themselves as the longest running modern surf band, distinguishing themselves from the original wave of surf bands from the 50s and 60s. They've put out dozens of albums over the years. Unfortunately, it seems like a lot of them are out of print and completely unavailable, but their more recent stuff is. So if you want to check them out, you get to see what a modern long-running surf band sounds like. And finally, this is one of my absolute favorites, the Bambi Molesters. Now, with a name like that, how can you go wrong? But wait, there's more. They're from Croatia. I mean, really? They're a Croatian surf guitar band. And, you know, I don't know how you get more outlandish than that. They have some serious chops, high energy, high intensity performances with their music. I just love them. I think they're fantastic. Can't get enough of them. So, yeah, I mean, you see, this is a big list, and that's not even hardly scratching the surface. There are new surf bands forming every day. It is a genre that constantly has an influx of new material. Lots and lots and lots and lots of vintage material. There is back catalogs galore, so it's easy to see how one could compose a playlist composed of solely of surf guitar music and never run out of source material. So if you're looking for a modern interpretation of tiki soundtracks, then by all means, go with the surf. Okay, surf was a biggie. So you must be thinking, with what can he possibly follow up surf with that will make any type of impact on my playlist at all? Well, I'll tell you. You ready for a curveball? Okay, here it comes. Latin big band. You're like, what? What's he mean, Latin big band? Okay. If you have not read Potions of the Caribbean by Jeff Beachbum-Berry, do so now. Something that completely drives me nuts is when people say, Tiki's not Caribbean, Tiki's Polynesian. Wrong. Okay, Tiki takes a lot of elements from Polynesia, but it also takes a lot, seriously, a lot of elements from the Caribbean. And prior to exotica, some of the most exotic sounds out there were coming from the Caribbean. Often overlooked, Latin big bands shared a lot of music with calypso and exotica. They produced a lot of material that's just right for a home tiki bar. Okay, that makes sense because tiki, again, would not exist without its Caribbean influences. Now, I'm going to give you a few here to get you started, but you're on your own, okay? Edmundo Rose. He was kind of my entry, my gateway drug into the Caribbean big band, Latin big band sound. He is a Trinidad native who had a tremendously successful career in Britain. Recently, a British publisher put out a career retrospective incorporating all of his studio, live, and radio broadcasts over like a dozen CDs. The guy was very talented. It's kind of odd hearing a Latin performer from the Caribbean with Caribbean bands speaking with a British accent, but he makes it work. He's got an interesting spin. The music is broadly accessible, very, very professional, a lot of skilled musicians in this group, and it's infectious and fun, very upbeat, quite nice, quite entertaining, widely accessible. Now, the next person is probably the Lord Emperor of all the Latin big bands, and that's Xavier Cugat. He is Spanish-born. He grew up in Cuba. He's hugely influential. He's a hugely influential band leader. He became so popular, he was regularly featured in Hollywood movies, especially the musical extravaganzas. Oftentimes, his bands would have one big show-stopping number in each of the movies that he starred in. Fantastic, innovative, creative band leader personality. Next is a name that you might be more familiar with as the husband of Lucille Ball. It's Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz was a Cuban exile. His parents didn't flee the communist takeover of Cuba. They fled the dictatorial Batista takeover of Cuba a couple decades prior to that, but exiles nonetheless. He was a band leader, a singer, performer, very, very talented man. He actually worked for Cugat as a singer early on, then spun off a career of his own until he met up with Lucille Ball, and he became a very influential and powerful television executive and producer. But before that, he was a band leader, and he was an excellent performer. I think his musical career is unfairly overshadowed by his later years. He's definitely worth seeking out. Not a lot of his original material is readily available, but what there is out there it's impressive. He's pretty good. A lot of charisma. Then finally, I want to throw in Carmen Miranda. You probably know her, if you ever heard of her at all, as a performer who would sing and dance with a hat piled up with fruit on there. That's a little bit of a caricature of her, but she was an immensely talented and an immensely charismatic performer. She was Brazilian, had a successful recording career in Brazil until before making the jump over to English language audiences. She appeared in many Hollywood musicals. At one point in the 1940s, she was the most highly paid woman in Hollywood. She was tremendously sought after, wildly influential, one of the most popular performers in North America. Strangely, though, she never headlined her own film. She was always like a supporting character, kind of a wacky, acerbic, wise-talking observer, kind of the Greek chorus, only she was Latin chorus. Unfortunately, she kind of got frustrated with Hollywood because they always cast her as a generic Latin American female. So she would either be Brazilian or Venezuelan or Cuban or Mexican. You know, Hollywood execs at that time didn't really care. Everyone from South America or Latin America, they were all the same. So she was just kind of generic that way. But she had a long-time successful singing career. There are lots of compilations of her work out there. Unlike some other performers, Carmen Miranda's career was long enough and varied enough and productive enough so that the compilations that are available now don't duplicate each other to a great extent. So you can buy 2 or 3 of best of Carmen Miranda's songs and have 60 songs there with maybe only 1 or 2 duplicates. So that's a big advantage because most of her original albums aren't available anymore. Oh gosh. And with that, I think we're coming to the conclusion of part 2 of Music for a Dark Tiki Bar. This was turning into quite a bit of an endeavor. Thank you for soldiering on with me, and stay tuned for part 3 when I think we're going to finish the rest of these and give you the makings of one heck of a varied and diverse Tiki Bar playlist. So until next time, aloha.